Hello chess friends and welcome to Yazarov's chess channel and welcome to the quarterfinal stage of the Skilling Open in 2020. Today's most interesting match game I think was the match game between Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen. So the concept of the quarterfinals is like this. First we'll have this four rapid games. Then tomorrow we'll have again the same match game again with four more rapid games. If the result after two match games is equal, then both of these players will have to play two more games. And then after that, if again the result is equal, then of course they'll play the so-called Armageddon game. So let's check out now the game 4 between Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen. The first three games ended in a draw. Anish Giri played, I think, so far really a great tournament. He was in the lead after 2 days, but he had really a bad third day, and he had now to face the world champion Magnus Carlsen in order to make it maybe to the semifinals. So let's check out now the game. Anish opened with the move e4. Magnus responds with the move e5. Knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, and now after bishop to c5 we have the so-called Italian game, the Gioco Piano. Really one of the most symmetrical lines. I really start to more and more like this opening. As I mentioned many times before, I really try to avoid it, but now when I see really some cool tactical lines by white, by black, I really should try it out again. After the move bishop to c5, of course, castling is played, nothing special so far. Knight to f6, we have d3, and now d6. We can really notice that the pawn structure is symmetrical. We have, of course, pinning ideas for both sides, bishop to g5, bishop to g4, that can be met with some kicking away ideas, h3, h6, maybe h3, g4. So really, as I said, the Gioco Piano and maybe the Ruy Lopez are the most complex of games. They have really this theoretical lines even till the move 30 or something. So that's why, as I said, that's the main reason why I really try to avoid it. After move d6, here Anish goes with the common c3 move. And the main idea about this move is, of course, a d4 pawn breakthrough. If we manage to connect two centralized pawns on the d4 and e4 square, then we could have, of course, the pawn central control, which is very important. Then we're restricting always these four centralized squares on the other side of the board. That's, I think, the most important goal now for white. In the game, Magnus plays now the move h6. He wants, of course, to create also maybe a d5 pawn breakthrough. Then he doesn't want to be vulnerable maybe to some attacks by the move bishop to g5. And here Anish goes knight to d2, and we have now castling by Magnus. We have rook to e1. This is a natural idea of the Gioco Piano and of the Italian game. Also in Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game, it can also happen, this move rook to e1. The main goal about this move is to move knight to f1, maybe knight to g3, and now knight to f5. We would love, of course, to cement one of these knights on the square f5. And because Magnus Carlsen has already a little bit weakened the pawn structure, this potential outpost on f5 couldn't be kicked away maybe with the g6 move, because then the h6 pawn would be hanging. So this is now maybe also sort of a strategical goal by white to get a very nice outpost on f5. In the game, Magnus tried a5. This is still common theory. As I said, this position has been played, I think, millions of times in chess history. a5, what we want to do with the move a5, we want to stay with this bishop on this long diagonal. That's the most important thing. Because the bishop could be kicked away with some b4 moves, so that's why we're staying on this long diagonal where we're attacking the weak f2 pawn. So the main weakness in white's position is, I think, the f2 pawn, because we can also attack it further with knight to g4. Still, it's of course protected with rook to f1 or rook to e2, but this is our clear target, as I said, from black's perspective. From white's perspective, maybe here a d4 pawn breakthrough motif, but also the weak square on f5, or maybe even the weak square on d5. These are the targets of white, the targets of black, as I said, the pawn on f2. So knight to f1, now comes this idea. We have bishop to e6. Black doesn't want to compete anymore with this very annoying bishop on c4. In the game, Anish tried bishop to b5. If you try bishop takes e6, it leads again, I think, into a more simplified line. A similar line yesterday Magnus Carlsen played with the white pieces against Vidit Gujrathi. It was really a tense battle between the two of them, but still I think both of these players have good chances even in this particular line. I think the main line now from white's perspective would be something like to compete also with this very annoying dark square bishop, to play the move bishop to e3. After bishop to e3, knight to e3, and this is now really also a very often played chess game. Very d5 pawn breakthrough motifs are possible here. Queen to b3 by white. So as I said, here after the move bishop to e6, Anish Giri goes with the move bishop to b5. And basically now the game, it's almost like it transposed into maybe similar structure like in the Ruy Lopez, because of course in the Ruy Lopez we're kicking away the bishop with a6 and then maybe b5, but now the bishop is on a Ruy Lopez sort of square, bishop to b5 of course, and now comes knight to e7 by Magnus. Here comes now the critical idea of this particular line. It's of course the move d4, and Magnus of course doesn't want to react. He wants to play bishop to a7. If you try something like e takes d4, okay, maybe c takes d4 can be played again. The bishop can move maybe to b6, even to a7. Okay, black has maybe lost a little bit the battle in the center, but these pawns I think can be also used as targets, because e4 weakness could happen here, also the d4 weakness could happen. This wasn't played in the game, but I still think, although white has here a dominant center position, still this position can be maybe kicked with the move d5. Then basically we're forcing now white to show his cards after something like maybe e5. If we play d5 and then e5 happens, then we could cement our knight maybe on a very active square on e4. So it's not so easy to play with the centralized pawns in the center. Remember, you should always remember that when playing chess, the hanging pawn structure in the center can be also sometimes, although it seems like a good idea, but it can be also an object of your opponent's attack. So that's why here in the game Magnus, after the move d4, tried bishop to a7, and basically he left a little bit now the e5 pawn hanging. In the game d takes e5, and now comes the move knight to g4. That's, as I said, the main target was the move f, the pawn move here, the pawn weakness on f2, so that's why Anish has to react with bishop to e3. And now after knight takes e3, we have now basically a theoretical novelty again by Magnus Carlsen. He takes simply. After knight takes e3, we have d takes e5, and Anish Giri simply grabs the pawn. Okay, let's stop and evaluate the position. Magnus Carlsen has, of course, the bishop pair. It's an open game. Anish has now the extra pawn, but this bishop's activities, this long diagonal of the Radjabov bishop, is something that I think should always worry white here, although with the pawn up, but I still think that black could find counterattack possibilities if the queen, for instance, comes here into the game. Very, very dangerous here, maybe to f4, combined with this bishop, combined maybe with some rook activity, combined with this bishop, still a dangerous game here for white. So in the game after knight to e5, Magnus tries a very interesting idea, knight to g6, challenging the knight immediately, because we want to occupy first of all the weak square f4 here. That's what we love to do, and that's why here Anish goes knight takes g6. We have f takes g6, and now you see we have again opened some files. This is a perfect position for the bishops, although we are down a pawn, but this is, as I said, very, very dangerous, this bishop's activity. This bishop can be included, the queen, for instance, can be included into the game. In the game, Anish make, I think now, the slight inaccuracy. It's the move queen takes d8, and there is, at least when I started to play chess and when I started to learn about the basic principles in chess, there is one rule in chess which says to take is a mistake. When you have a tension like here on the d file, you should at least try to avoid somehow to trade off the pieces, because now after the move queen takes d8, rook takes d8 of course, and you see now white has lost a little bit the battle on the d file. That's the most important thing. We have basically invited our opponent's rook into the game, and that's a huge problem. A better idea is here to play the move queen to c2, maybe hang on to our extra pawn. The problem now, again, after a potential maybe queen to f6 move, is that we cannot fix the position. We cannot play the move f3. That's the move I think we would love to make, and then maybe hide with our king here to h1, find a good square maybe for the knight, and really improve first our pawn structure. But the problem is now this move cannot happen, because you get a nice tactical shot, queen to g5, and it comes with a double attack on the knight, but also on the bishop. But I think maybe, of course, f3 is not possible, but there are maybe some other lines, maybe something to play queen to e2, rook to e2, simply improving, first fixing our position. But in the game, as I said, here Anish invited Magnus Carlsen's rook into the game, rook to d8, and now rook to e2, because there are also now some threats around this f2. In the game, rook to e2 was played, and now comes bishop takes e3. And again, Anish makes maybe a slight inaccuracy. He plays the move f takes e3. A better idea is rook takes e3, although as I said, you lost a little bit your battle on the d file. That's what's the problem about the trades of queens on the d file. Now you're inviting again your opponent's rook into the game, but maybe this is playable after rook to e2. We're competing, and again something like rook to d8, king to f1, maybe a trades of rooks can happen, and I think this would lead maybe into a perpetual line and probably into a draw. But Anish took, as I said here, let's go back. He took now with the pawn, and this is now a huge problem because Magnus Carlsen can go now into a better endgame. What we can notice, let's stop and again evaluate this pawn structure. Here is the problem of this particular endgame. Although white is the one that has a pawn up, we have here a 4 versus 3 situation on the king side. But the most important thing here to notice, I want to pay really good attention, it's really a nice endgame strategy here. Magnus has now here a 3 versus 2 situation, so maybe in some occasions he could create a pass pawn. But the problem about this pass pawn is that it's a distant pass pawn. So if you could just imagine this position without bishops, rooks on the board with the same pawn structure. So it means black's king will go probably here to e5. On the other hand, white's king would be always forced to protect here the king side, because as I said, we have here a 3 versus 2 situation. So that's why when the king, for instance, white king goes after this pawns and Magnus Carlsen's king goes after the centralized pawns, then Magnus Carlsen's king is much more near here to these 3 pawns, and this could be a favorable endgame. If this position, as I said, goes into an endgame without rooks and bishops on the board, this is a good endgame here for black. Incredible stuff, as I said, although you're a pawn up, but you have really a bad pawn structure, sort of. So it's really incredible. I think that it's something that Magnus Carlsen has prepared at home, because this line has never been played in chess history, this sacrificing the pawn on e5 line. Really great theoretical novelty. I think great preparation by Magnus Carlsen. I think he wanted to get this position till this particular moment, and now we can see the distant pass pawn idea here is a great one. I think we can at least do something here. We can play the move king to e5 and at least create sort of a blockade with our king and battling with the rooks here on the d file, f file, not inviting our opponent somehow into the game, maybe trading off the pieces. Trading off pieces, as I said, would be a good idea. So I think something went wrong here for Anish, because he tried bishop to a4, and now when you feel that you're basically worse in the position here, Anish Giri makes really mistake after mistake. He doesn't play really this precise moves. Maybe if he plays the best endgame, he can make a draw here. King to e7, we have h3, bishop to c4, rook to c2, and now rook to d3. You see now how Magnus infiltrates in white's position. That's the point. As I said, we have traded off the queens on the d file. Now it's black that simply has the domination on that very important file on the board. Rook to e1, we have king to d6 played by Magnus, bishop to b3, attacking the bishop. But of course, when we are on the attacking side, we don't want to trade off pieces. We want to complicated positions. Now the king can come to e5, then we can probably take out this pawn, and also then afterwards this pawn is a weakness. Incredible prep by Magnus. So rook to c1, we have king to e5, rook to d1, rook to d8, we're simply doubling up. Here bishop to d3 was played, king to f2, and now Magnus goes rook to d6. We have bishop to d1, bishop to c4, and now b3. We have rook to d1, rook to d2, attacking the king. Very important move, Zwischenzug by Magnus Carlsen. Very cool move, because the king has to move now from the second rank, and now also this pawn is hanging first. Of course, we get back here with our bishop to e6, rook to f1. But the cool part about Anish Giri's about Magnus Carlsen's setup, pardon me, is that the king and the bishop are covering this very important square. So there's no way, so far at least, that the rook will come on the 7th rank and attack these pawns on the 7th rank. So here Magnus simply takes a pawn. Maybe instead of this rook to f1 idea, maybe you should try something like a4, but then we can maybe play something like rook to d3 again. You were forced maybe to play something like c4, and here d6. We are playing simply some moves in order to, we're playing basically now sort of a Zugzwang motif. We're waiting now white to make a move, and then we can take out this pawn, and go into better continuation, of course, with this 3 versus 2 situation. All of these pawns, but in this particular case, of course, all of these pawns are on light squares, which is also very important to notice, because they are an object also of the attack here of the light square bishop. So that's why when you play with your light square bishop, you should place many of your pawns on opposite colors, because then you see this bishop cannot attack them. So here, this wasn't played in the game, but as I said, rook to f1, and Magnus simply grabs a pawn. We have bishop to g4, again, another mistake by Anish. Bishop takes b3. This is basically winning endgame here, and we know how Magnus plays this very important, very tense endgames. He's really the endgame master. So here, king takes e4. We have rook to c7. Magnus grabs another pawn. Bishop to d5, protecting first everything. Here, bishop to f3. We have g takes f3, and now rook to b2, protecting first the pawn. Okay, Anish took, but now after rook to b6, everything is fixed. We have a protection. Even if you try to attack this pawn, we can play a5 and simply push our pass pawn. A pass pawn situation is very important, of course, in this rook endgames. And the most important thing here is notice that it can be a supported pass pawn, of course, with the move rook to a6, where we're going behind our pawn, and we simply push it first. So that's why after the move c4, Magnus, of course, improves first the position of his king. We have rook to c7. And now Magnus goes for the simple idea, pushing the pawn. We have c6, rook takes b7. Here, king takes c5. And now you have to go back here. Here, Magnus Carlsen pushed simply the pawn. Rook to a4, cutting off, very important move to cut off here the king's potential activity. And now Magnus blocks the position, very important move also here. h5, never allow this king to come here, maybe on g5, where it could attack this weak pawns. So that's why king to f1, and now king to f3, pardon me. And now after king to e3, here Magnus Carlsen goes to e6, and in this position Anish Giri resigned, because there's nothing you can do. You cannot do some checks, you cannot do perpetuals. Of course, if you move this rook, then of course a promotion will happen, and Magnus' main idea is, of course, to get the king on f5 and simply take out this pawn on f4, and then really it's game over. So okay, this was now the first win for Magnus Carlsen in this match game. So he won the first match game. Today they'll meet again in another match game. So Anish Giri has to win that match game to make it maybe to the additional games. Then 2 more games will be played if Anish manages to win the next match game against Magnus. So far, a very equalized match game it was, I think, but I really think that Magnus Carlsen tricked here Anish Giri into really one of his homemade preparation lines. I think this was something that Magnus Carlsen was really familiar with, because sacrificing a pawn in this types of position very risky. It seems to me that he basically went for a draw, because we have seen that this particular line could lead into a draw, but Anish Giri made a couple of inaccuracies and got punished. Now it was simply a good day for Magnus Carlsen. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. Really interesting line in the Gioco Piano. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my Skilling Open tournament series. Here's the link. And if you want to see maybe the best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.